For 600 years, one family ruled more of Europe than any dynasty before or since. Then, in a single autumn, they lost all of it. The thrones, the palaces, the empire, the country itself. Austria wrote a law with their surname in the title and told them never to come back. So where are they now? Much closer than you'd think. Because unlike almost every other royal house that collapsed in the 20th century, the Habsburgs were never wiped out. There was no firing squad, no vanished bloodline, no mystery about what happened to the children. They simply walked out of history through a side door and kept living. And if you had been at the Circuit de la Sarthe in France in the summer of 2021, watching the world's most famous endurance race come down to its final laps, you were watching a direct descendant of the last emperor of Austria climb out of a race car as a winner. We'll get to him. But to understand how a family goes from ruling 50 million people to standing on a motorsport podium, you have to understand where they started, because they didn't start as emperors either. They started as almost nobody. Somewhere around the 1020s, in what is now the Swiss canton of Aargau, a minor lord built a castle on a hill above the Aar River. It was not a grand fortress. It was a stone tower and a wall, the kind of thing hundreds of small nobles across Europe were building at the time to control a stretch of farmland and a river crossing. The name attached to it was Habsburg. It's usually explained as Hawk's Castle, though historians still argue about that. What matters is that the family who lived there took the castle's name as their own, and for the next 200 years they did what small noble families did. They married locally, they collected tolls, they picked the right side in regional quarrels, and they slowly, unglamorously accumulated land. By the middle of the 1200s, they were counts, respectable but not important. They were not kings, they were not electors, and no chronicler in Paris or Rome would have been able to tell you their names. And then, in 1273, something happened that changed the shape of Europe, and it happened precisely because the Habsburgs were unimportant. The Holy Roman Empire, that sprawling patchwork of German-speaking states, had been without a proper king for years. The great princes who held the right to elect a new one had a problem. Every strong candidate frightened them. A powerful king would push them around, seize their privileges, and turn their loose confederation into a real monarchy. So the electors did what committees have always done when they're afraid. They chose the safest name on the list. They chose a 55-year-old provincial count from a small castle in the Alps. His name was Rudolf of Habsburg, and the entire point of choosing him was that he seemed manageable. He was not manageable. That miscalculation is one of the most expensive in European history, and it produced a family that would go on to shape 6 centuries. Rudolf immediately went after the most powerful man in the empire, Ottokar II of Bohemia, who had spent years hoovering up territory and who had expected the crown for himself. Ottokar refused to recognize the new king. In 1278, the two armies met on the Marchfeld, the flat plain northeast of Vienna. Ottokar was defeated and killed, and Rudolf, this supposedly harmless little count, walked away with the prize. Austria. Hold that word in your head, because everything that follows grows out of it. Austria was not the Habsburg homeland. They took it, and once they had it, they never let go. Habsburgs would rule from Vienna, in one form or another, for more than 600 straight years, right up until the century your grandparents were born in. But conquest was never the family's real weapon. Here is the strange thing about the Habsburgs, and the reason they lasted when louder dynasties burned out. They were, not by and large, great generals. They lost wars constantly. What they were exceptionally good at was something far less cinematic. They were good at weddings. There's a line in Latin that got attached to them centuries ago and never came off. Bella gerunt ali, tu felix Austria, nube. Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. It was meant as a jab. It was also an accurate description of the most successful land acquisition strategy in European history. Watch how it works. In 1477, Maximilian of Habsburg married Mary of Burgundy, the only child of the richest duke in Europe. Overnight, the family inherited the Burgundian Netherlands, the wealthiest urban region on the continent, the wool and banking heartland of the north. No battle required. Then their son Philip married Joanna, heiress to the crowns of Castile and Aragon. That marriage was supposed to be a routine diplomatic alliance. Instead, through a chain of deaths nobody planned for, it made the Habsburgs the heirs to Spain, and Spain, at that exact moment, was in the process of claiming the Americas. Which brings us to a boy born in the city of Ghent in the year 1500, who would inherit the single most absurd collection of titles ever assembled on one head. His name was Charles. Through his father's side, he inherited the Netherlands and the Habsburg Austrian lands. Through his mother's side, he inherited Spain, southern Italy, and the entire Spanish claim to the New World. In 1519, the imperial electors handed him the Holy Roman crown as well. He was 19. He ruled territory from the Danube to the Andes, and it was of his empire, not the British one, that people first said the sun never set on it, and he hated it. Charles spent his adult life in the saddle, moving endlessly between his own realms, fighting France, fighting the Ottomans, and watching the Protestant Reformation split the German world apart under his feet. He is one of the very few emperors in history to voluntarily quit. In the mid-1550s, exhausted, gout-ridden, and by his own account defeated, he abdicated, and then he made a decision that quietly determined the next 400 years. He split the family in two. Spain, the Netherlands, Italy, and the Americas went to his son Philip. Austria, the German lands, and the imperial title went to his brother Ferdinand. From that moment there were two Habsburg houses, the Spanish branch and the Austrian branch, and the two branches, wanting to keep this enormous inheritance inside the family, began marrying each other, cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, again and again and again for generation after generation. That is the decision that killed one half of the dynasty. But the way it killed them is not what most people assume, and it takes 150 years to arrive. Keep it in mind, because when it lands, it starts a world war. While the family was quietly consuming itself, it was also building something that still stands. Vienna, under the Habsburgs, became one of the great capitals of European culture, not because the emperors were brilliant artists, but because they were relentless patrons with very deep pockets. The Spanish riding school, founded in the 16th century and still operating today, exists because a Habsburg wanted classical horsemanship preserved. The Vienna court became the gravitational center of European music. The composers we now treat as the foundation of the Western canon spent their careers circling Habsburg patronage and Habsburg audiences. The Schönbrunn Palace, the Hofburg, the imperial collections that fill Vienna's museums, all of it is the physical residue of a family that understood, long before anyone used the word, that legitimacy is something you build in stone and perform in public. They were also, for their era, unusually multi-ethnic rulers. The lands they governed contained Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, Italians, Slovenes, Ukrainians, and more. There was no single Habsburg nation. The only thing holding that mosaic together was the dynasty itself, loyalty to the family, not to a flag or a language. That worked for centuries. In the age of nationalism, it would become the exact fault line the empire cracked along. Now, back to Spain, and the price of all those cousin marriages. In 1665, a boy named Charles II inherited the Spanish throne. He was 4 years old. He was gravely ill for most of his life, unable to fulfill the basic functions his court expected of a king, and, most consequentially, unable to father a child. Modern geneticists have gone back through the Habsburg family tree and calculated just how concentrated his ancestry was. The figure they arrived at is roughly what you'd expect from the child of two siblings, the accumulated result of generations of marrying within the family. A separate study looked at the famous protruding jaw visible in Habsburg portraits across the centuries, and found it tracked the same pattern of intermarriage. Charles II of Spain died in 1700, at 38, with no heir. The Spanish Habsburg line, the branch that ruled half the known world, simply ended. There was nobody left. And because the Spanish crown was the biggest unclaimed prize in Europe, the continent went to war over the empty chair. The War of the Spanish Succession lasted more than a decade, and pulled in Britain, France, Austria, the Dutch Republic, and beyond. When the treaties were finally signed, Spain went to the French Bourbons. It has never returned to Habsburg hands. That left one branch standing, Vienna. And Vienna nearly went the same way. In 1740, Emperor Charles VI died, leaving no son, only a daughter, Maria Theresa. He had spent years pressuring every court in Europe to sign a document guaranteeing she could inherit. The moment he was in the ground, half of them tore it up and invaded. What followed is one of the great political survival stories of the 18th century. Maria Theresa, 23 years old and pregnant, held the inheritance together. She lost Silesia to Prussia and never got it back, but she kept the monarchy intact, then spent 40 years overhauling it, the tax system, the bureaucracy, the army, compulsory primary education. She also had 16 children, and she used them exactly as her ancestors had used marriages, as instruments of state. The youngest of her daughters was sent to Paris to marry the future king of France. Her name was Marie Antoinette, and she went to the guillotine in 1793. Maria Theresa's own marriage to Francis Stephen of Lorraine technically ended the House of Habsburg in the male line and began the House of Habsburg-Lorraine, which is still, legally, the family's name today. But nobody outside a genealogy department has ever called them anything but Habsburgs. Then came Napoleon, and the second great humiliation. The Holy Roman Empire, that 1,000-year-old title the family had held almost without interruption since 1438, was collapsing under French pressure. So in 1804, Emperor Francis did something no ruler had done before. He invented a brand new crown for himself, declaring himself Emperor of Austria, so that when the old empire died, he would still have an imperial title. 2 years later, in 1806, he formally dissolved the Holy Roman Empire. 1,000 years of continuity ended with a legal announcement. Notice what just happened, because it's the pattern of the entire family. Faced with extinction, the Habsburgs didn't fight to the last man. They restructured. They found a legal instrument, changed their own name for the thing they were, and carried on. That instinct is precisely why they still exist today, when the Romanovs do not. By the middle of the 19th century, the empire was under enormous strain, and in 1848 revolutions broke out across it. Out of that chaos came an 18-year-old emperor who would rule for 68 years and become, for millions of people across Central Europe, the only ruler they ever knew, Franz Joseph. His reign is a strange, terrible thing to read about. Politically, he presided over the last great flowering of Imperial Vienna and the Compromise of 1867 that turned the empire into Austria-Hungary, a dual monarchy with 2 parliaments and 1 crowned head. Personally, almost everyone he loved died violently or tragically. His younger brother Maximilian accepted a foreign throne in Mexico, backed by French troops. When the French withdrew, he was captured and executed by firing squad in 1867. His only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, died in 1889 at a hunting lodge called Meyerling alongside a young woman, a death the court recorded as suicide and then spent decades trying to bury. His wife, the Empress Elizabeth, the woman most people know as Sisi, was murdered by an anarchist on a lakeside promenade in Geneva in 1898. And in June 1914, his nephew and heir, Franz Ferdinand, was shot in Sarajevo. That last one you know the consequences of. Within weeks, the alliances of Europe had activated, and the First World War had begun. Franz Joseph died in 1916, in the middle of that war, after 68 years on the throne. His grandnephew, a 29-year-old named Karl, inherited an empire that was already losing. Karl spent his short reign trying to negotiate a secret peace. An attempt that failed, was exposed, and humiliated him in front of his own allies. And then, in the autumn of 1918, it was over. Not conquered, not stormed, dissolved. Czechs, Hungarians, Poles, Croats, Slovens, and Romanians declared their own states, and the empire evaporated into the nations you can still find on a map today. On the 11th of November 1918, Karl signed a proclamation renouncing any participation in the affairs of state. Read that carefully, because the wording is the whole story. He never abdicated. He never said the words, "I am no longer emperor." He stepped back from governing while refusing, technically, to stop being what he was. Austria declared itself a republic the next day. And here is where the Habsburg story becomes genuinely unlike any other fallen dynasty in Europe. Because the new republic did not exile them casually, it legislated them out of existence. On the 3rd of April 1919, Austria passed what is still known as the Habsburg Law. It dethroned the House of Habsburg-Lorraine by statute. It confiscated the family's property, and it banished them from the country, unless individually they signed a document renouncing all claims and declaring themselves loyal citizens of the republic. A modern European state wrote a law about one specific surname. Every child born with that name inherited its consequences. Karl refused to sign anything. In 1921, he twice tried to reclaim the Hungarian throne, flying into the country, gathering supporters, and both times being forced back out. After the second attempt, the Allied powers removed him permanently, and he and his pregnant wife Zita were placed on a British warship and taken to the Atlantic island of Madeira. They arrived with almost nothing. The family lived in a cold, damp house up in the hills above Funchal. In the spring of 1922, Karl caught a chill that turned into pneumonia. There was no money for proper heating, and no possibility of leaving. He died on the 1st of April 1922. He was 34 years old. The last emperor of Austria was buried on a small island 1,000 miles from Vienna, and his body is still there. In 2004, Pope John Paul II beatified him. He left behind a widow of 29, 8 children, and a 9th on the way. What Zita did next is the reason the family still exists in any recognizable form. She was, by every account, immovable. She put on black mourning clothes and wore them for the rest of her life, 67 years. She refused, absolutely and permanently, to recognize the loss of the throne, and she raised her children as though the empire were merely interrupted. They moved between Spain, Belgium, and eventually across the Atlantic when the Nazis came. The Habsburg Law had been briefly repealed in the 1930s. After the Anschluss in 1938, the Nazis reimposed it, and it stayed on Austria's books after the war. Zita was not permitted to set foot in Austria again until 1982. She was 90. When she died in 1989 at 96, she was given a funeral in Vienna that filled the streets, enormous crowds, in a republic, for the widow of a monarchy that had been gone for 70 years. She was buried in the imperial crypt beneath the Capuchin church, where the Habsburg dead have been laid since the 1600s. Which brings us to the boy she raised, and to the most remarkable second act any deposed heir has ever had. Otto von Habsburg was born in 1912. He was 4 years old when his father became emperor. He was 6 when the empire ceased to exist. He became head of the house at 9. He spent his childhood being tutored in the languages and history of countries he was told he would one day rule, and he spent the 1930s as one of the most vocal anti-Nazi voices among European exiles, which put him on a Gestapo list and made him, for a period, a stateless man. And then Otto did something his mother had refused to do for 6 decades. In 1961, he signed the Declaration. He renounced all claims to the throne and declared himself a loyal citizen of the Austrian Republic. It caused a political firestorm. It took years of legal fighting before he was actually allowed to enter the country, which finally happened in 1966. He was 53, and it was the first time he had stood on Austrian soil since he was a small child. Then he did something even stranger. He ran for office. In 1979, Otto von Habsburg was elected to the European Parliament as a representative from Bavaria in Germany. He served for 20 years. The man who had been raised as the heir to 50 million subjects spent his career voting in a democratic chamber, arguing for European integration, and above all, for the eastern half of the continent, the old Habsburg lands, then behind the Iron Curtain, to be brought back in. In August 1989, a friendship picnic was organized on the Hungarian-Austrian border near Sopron, with Otto as one of its patrons. The plan was a symbolic opening of a border gate. What actually happened was that hundreds of East Germans who had gathered nearby ran through it into Austria, and the Hungarian guards let them go. It is now remembered as one of the first cracks in the Iron Curtain. The Berlin Wall fell 3 months later. Think about the shape of that life. Born the heir to a doomed empire, buried it at 6, renounced it at 48, and then helped dismantle the thing that had replaced it. Not with an army, but with a parliamentary seat and a picnic. Otto died in 2011, aged 98. He had handed the headship of the family to his eldest son a few years earlier. His funeral in Vienna was, again, extraordinary for a republic. A full imperial-style procession through the city to the Capuchin church. And at the door they performed the ceremony the Habsburgs have used for centuries. The procession knocks. A voice inside asks who seeks entry. The herald recites the titles: Archduke of Austria, Royal Prince of Hungary and Bohemia, and the long list of the rest. The voice answers, "We do not know him." They knock again. The herald gives the honors, the offices, the decorations. Again, "We do not know him." They knock a third time, and this time the answer is simply that he is a mortal, sinful man. The doors open. That is the family's own summary of itself, performed at every funeral. Everything you accumulate is refused at the door. Otto's body lies in the crypt in Vienna. His heart, at his request, was buried separately at Pannonhalma Archive in Hungary, a deliberate final gesture toward the other half of the dual monarchy. So, where are they now? They are, first of all, numerous. There are hundreds of Habsburg descendants alive today, scattered across Austria, Germany, Hungary, Spain, Italy, and beyond. They are ordinary citizens of ordinary republics. In Austria, the use of noble titles was abolished in 1919. The family's legal surname is Habsburg-Lothringen, and calling someone an archduke there is a courtesy, not a status. The current head of the house is Karl von Habsburg, born in 1961, grandson of the last emperor. Like his father, he went into European politics, serving as a member of the European Parliament in the 1990s. Much of his public work since has been about protecting cultural heritage in war zones through the Blue Shield organization, which works to stop museums, monuments, and archives from being destroyed in conflicts. He is also sovereign of the Austrian branch of the Order of the Golden Fleece, the chivalric order the family has carried since it came to them through that Burgundian marriage in 1477. His younger brother Georg took a different route. He became a Hungarian citizen, and then a Hungarian diplomat. He served as Hungary's ambassador to France for several years, and then, in 2025, he was appointed Hungary's ambassador to Spain. Sit with that for a moment. In early 2026, a Habsburg walked into the royal palace in Madrid to present his credentials to King Felipe VI, a descendant of the family that ruled Spain for nearly 200 years, arriving as a foreign envoy in the country his ancestors lost in 1700. Another relative, Edward Habsburg-Lothringen, spent a decade as Hungary's ambassador to the Holy See and became something close to an internet personality along the way, a working diplomat with a public presence, writing books and posting online. And then there's the heir. Karl's son Ferdinand, born in 1997, is a professional racing driver. In 2021, driving for Team WRT alongside Robin Freins and Charles Miesi, he won the LMP2 class at the 24 Hours of Le Mans after a final lap turnaround and took the World Endurance title in the same class that year. He has since moved up to the top category of the World Endurance Championship. The heir to the headship of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine, the family that once claimed the Holy Roman Crown, spends his weekends at 200 miles an hour. His sister Eleanor has built a career as a jewelry designer. Even the Habsburg law has partly given way. Austria was required to strike down the provisions banning family members from entering the country before it joined the European Union in 1995. In 2010, a distant relative named Ulrich Habsburg Lothringen, a Green politician in Carinthia, tried to run for the Austrian presidency and was blocked by the constitutional clause barring former ruling families. He challenged it. In June 2011, the Austrian parliament repealed that clause unanimously. A Habsburg is now legally allowed to run for head of state in the republic that expelled them. The law itself has never been fully erased. The confiscation of the family's property still stands, and the family has spent decades pursuing claims that Austrian courts have consistently rejected. So the Habsburgs remain, uniquely, a family that a European constitution still has an opinion about, and that is the real answer to the question. The Persians of the ancient world dissolved into a modern nation. The Romanovs ended in a cellar. The Ottomans were put on trains and told never to return. The Habsburgs did none of those things. They lost everything they had accumulated over 600 years. The crowns, the palaces, the land, the titles, even the legal right to their own names, and then they did the one thing they had always been best at. They adapted, and they stayed. The dynasty that was chosen in 1273 precisely because it seemed harmless outlasted the empire it built, the law that banished it, and the century that was supposed to end it. Today its members are ambassadors, politicians, heritage campaigners, designers, and racing drivers. They hold passports, not thrones. And under the church in central Vienna, in a crypt that is still in use, more than 100 of them lie beneath a city that stopped being theirs over 100 years ago and never quite stopped belonging to them. Thanks for watching. If you want to know how another empire's family survived the fall, the next one's waiting for you right here.